6. Institutional psychoanalysis and the paradoxes of archivization. We know that in the mass of mankind there is a powerful need for an authority who can be admired, before whom one bows down, by whom one is ruled and perhaps even ill-treated. We have learned from the psychology of individual men what the origin is of this need of the masses. It is a longing for the father felt by everyone from his childhood onwards. The decisiveness of thought, the strength of will, the energy of action are part of the picture of the father, but above all the autonomy and independence of the great man, his divine unconcern which may grow into ruthlessness. One must admire him, one may trust him, but one cannot avoid being afraid of him. 2.1 Introductory remarks. Derrida's third thesis in outline with unsurpassable subtlety, Freud analyzed, that is also to say, deconstructed what Derrida calls the archontic principle of the archive which, he notes, concerns the nomenological arc of the law, of institution, of domiciliation, of filiation. To this principle describes the movement by which the authority that presided over the archive is repeated across generations. As, arguably, the paternal and patriarchic principle, it presupposes that the authority vested in the father is directed toward its repetition in the sons. Freud uncovers the paradox whereby not even the strongest rebellion, parasite, circumvents the circular return of this same authority. At best, the archontic principle of the archive dictates that parasite will merely amount to the pseudo-democratic takeover of the archive by the brothers. This archontic circle, then, names the principle of the movement that traps father and son in a stifling circle of neurotic repetition. However, as a self-inventive theoretical pioneer, Freud himself subverts this archontic principle. He did not merely draw out the unknown in the existing archive, what was, until then, secret in it, but insisted upon something radically heterogeneous to it, so highlighting the character of the archive as itself an invention. 3. One could, therefore, legitimately expect from him not only some indication of a way out of the archontic circle of patriarchy in the recognition of an excess that threatens every archive but also extreme sensitivity to the dangers of getting caught in its trap himself. Through his institutionalization of psychoanalysis. Yet, in practice, Derrida argues, Freud remained patriarchal. He declared, notably in the Rat Man, that the patriarchal right, vis marked the civilizing progress of reason. Moreover, he was overly concerned with constituting psychoanalysis as a discipline, with assuring his legacy by remaining the archon, the patriarch, who had always already configured what could be said by his children in his name. In Derrida's words, in life as in his works, in his theoretical theses as in the compulsion of his institutionalizing strategy, Freud repeated the patriarchal logic. He remained under the spell of the archontic principle, to the point Derrida notes, that certain people can wonder if, decades after his death, his sons, so many brothers, can yet speak in their own name. Or if his daughter ever came to life to adumbrate the theme of Part 3. Derrida's remark here tacitly raises the related questions of Lacan's return to Freud and of women. Does Lacan's return automatically trap him in the archontic circle to the point that he cannot speak in his own name? Or, if he claims to speak in his own name, is he still practicing psychoanalysis? In more general terms, can there be a reinvention of Freudian psychoanalysis that is still psychoanalysis? Derrida's arguments in various contexts unequivocally affirm that there can, indeed must, be inventive appropriation of any institution. Moreover, as addressed at length in the previous chapters, it is precisely Freud, in his Economic Moments, who gives him the means to make this argument. Derrida, then, in demonstrating that psychoanalysis always already inscribes its own economic subversion beyond its more traditionally accepted economic description, offers just such an inventive appropriation of it. Curiously, however, he does not grant Lacan the equivalent reinventive power, presumably because he does not see in Lacan's arguments the plural logic of the aporia. Here I have to disagree with him. Instead, it is more likely that Lacan similarly reinvents psychoanalysis, drawing Freud's thinking past its residual metaphysical and patriarchal commitments into the domain of the aporia. Simultaneously, 184 Lacan's reinvention of psychoanalysis is a matter of bringing the feminine to life, sadly, not Freud's daughter, however, who, in Lacan's view, remains a faithful servant of the conservative in Freud. Freud's insight into the structure of the archontic circle. Freud's myth of parasite in totem and taboo. Since Derrida's thesis explicitly refers to Freud's articulation of the archontic circle in totem and taboo, it will be necessary to open this and a companion work, Moses and Monotheism. But here one encounters a richly spun web of highly contentious speculations concerning an original parasite, stretching across diverse fields of inquiry, the proper critique of which would require expertise beyond the scope and focus of this chapter. However, even if Freud's historical/anthropological speculations are all questionable as hypotheses concerning actual events in prehistory, they nevertheless reveal a good deal about the circular structure of archontic authority. On the whole, then, it seems justifiable to sidestep the myriad difficulties concerning Freud's historical and socio-psychological speculations by leaving aside the issue of material truth and by treating his speculative hypothesis of an original parasite as a mythical construction that offers a certain psychical truth concerning the structure of the specific kind of authority relation inscribed in the archontic circle. Based on Darwin's proposal, Freud speculates that the earliest humans must have lived together in hordes, that is, small groups of women and small children presided over by a violent and jealous father who keeps all the females for himself and drives away his sons as they grow up. For presumably, those who survived this cruel eviction would eventually snatch a female or two from some other horde and begin their own. However, Freud notes, this original state has never been observed, and the most archaic social form observable today replaces the dominant patriarch with bands of males who enjoy equal rights subject to the dictates of a totemic system within which the fundamental taboos are prohibitions against injuring the totem and incest. 5 Freud insists that the more democratic form of organization that characterizes the totem clan must have developed from out of the primal horde. His question is, along what lines? 6 An account of such a transition, he argues, would have to explain why the new social contract went hand in hand with the intense emotional ambivalence and irrational excesses of totemism, which he sees as a precursor to current forms of religious practice. It would also have to explain the mystery of the incest. 185 taboo. The necessity of a prohibition implies that there are no reliable natural barriers against the temptation to practice incest. In fact, our first choice of a love object is often incestuous. Moreover, such a taboo could not have been supported at its origin, as it might be today, by modern genetics or by experience of the detrimental effects of inbreeding. Such decadence, were it clearly established, would in any case have taken generations to manifest. Also, mythology teaches that incest is allowed to the gods, and ancient history teaches that incestuous marriage was required of certain rulers. Thus Freud concludes incest was a privilege forbidden to the common herd and its taboo was a matter of power rather than science. 7 Psychoanalytical experience, Freud argues, particularly concerning the Oedipus complex and obsessional neurosis, enables one to bring together under a single explanatory construction the otherwise mystifying ideas and practices at the origin of civilization, including the social contract, the fundamental taboos that prohibit injury to the totem and incest, thereby promoting exogamy, and the paradoxical totem feast vestiges of which remain in certain contemporary religions. 8 The young males in the horde, he speculates, must have experienced the contradictory feelings at work in the ambivalent father complexes of contemporary children and neurotics. Although no doubt they loved their formidable father as an admired model, they must also have hated him for the harsh embargo he placed on their aspirations toward power and sex and sorely envied his privileged access to the women. If their hatred becomes overpowering, the love and awe are repressed and they find themselves denying that the father has any good qualities. Conceivably, then, the ousted brothers finally banded together and, so united, gained the courage and strength to do what each individual youth desired but could not have done alone, namely kill and devour their father, so identifying themselves with him and gaining for each a portion of his power. 9 But how could such a murder be the inaugurating moment of civilization? Having disposed of the father, Freud notes, one would expect the brothers to turn upon one another in a bitter struggle for succession. No doubt this did occur, but it could not have been the predominant or final outcome of the parasite, for in this case, one tyrant would simply have replaced another without generating any impetus toward what Freud sees as the next social stage, at which numbers of males live together in a peaceable community tend to account for the prevalence of democracy among men in human societies. Freud offers the following psychological explanation: after they got rid of him, had satisfied their hatred and had put into effect their wish to identify themselves with him, the affection 186 which had all this time been pushed under was bound to make itself felt. Moreover, he notes, more cynically, this fresh emotional attitude must also have been assisted by the fact that the deed cannot have given complete satisfaction to those who did it. From one point of view it had been done in vain. Not one of the sons had in fact been able to put his original wish, of taking his father's place, into effect. 11 As an expression of remorse, then, the brothers hoped to bring about a symbolic reconciliation with the murdered tyrant by replacing him with a substitute or totem which epitomized the good father. A totem is defined as a sacred thing, endowed with awe-inspiring powers, and treated with the greatest veneration and self-sacrifice. According to Freud, appropriate animals were the natural first candidates to represent the lost father, but over time totems became more various, successively taking on part normal / part human forms, all human forms, the spiritual forms of gods and demons, and abstract forms such as names. 12 Totemism, he continues, is a covenant between the brothers and their father substitute, in which he promised them everything that a childish imagination may expect from a father: protection, care and indulgence, while on their side, they undertook to respect his life, that is to say, not to repeat the deed which had brought destruction on their real father. 13 The brothers thus amplify the goodness and the power of the totem, which will protect them as long as they obediently measure up to its demands. Thus, totemism contains an element of self-justification. If our father had treated us in the way the totem does, we should never have felt tempted to kill him. 14 Having become totem worshippers, the brothers impose on themselves myriad taboos that prevent any hint of injury to the totem and confirm their obedience. 15 Taboos, however, are not ordinary prohibitions with a clear, pragmatic basis, such as a prohibition against swimming in waters where there are known dangers. Instead, they are excessive prohibitions, often taking the form of arbitrary, seemingly irrational, unusually severe restrictions on physical mobility and pleasure. They appear to be loaded with the demand for expiation or atonement and inflict physical suffering or punishment seemingly in advance of any actual transgression or offense against the totem. In other words, these taboos reflect a self-punishing renunciation of the fruits of their crime in an effort to allay the guilt associated with the original murder. Herein lies the emotional motive for instituting the incest taboo, by which the brothers renounce the very women they desired and for access to whom they had murdered the father. This sense that the women truly belong to the powerful, or, anticipating the Oedipus complex, that the mother truly 187 belongs to the father, explains psychologically why the incest taboo is a matter of power rather than science. This renunciation might have been supported by pragmatic concerns. Sexual desire, as Freud explains, is divisive. It turns all men into rivals. Although the brothers needed one another to overpower their father, each would have harbored a wish to take his father's place as sole despot concerning women. Struggles of all against all probably took place, to the detriment of the group. To preserve the unified brotherhood that was their strength and power, therefore, Freud concluded that the brothers had no alternative except to institute the law against incest. 16 So far, Freud has gathered together in a single explanatory framework the indispensable constituents of totemism, which are, in his words, the worship of the totem, which includes a prohibition against injuring or killing it, exogamy, that is, renunciation of the passionately desired mothers and sisters. In the horde, the granting of equal rights to all the members of the fraternal alliance, that is, restricting the inclination to violent rivalry among them. 17 Notably, however, the fundamental taboos of totemism reflect precisely the will of the murdered father. In Freud's words, what had up to then been prevented by his actual existence was thenceforward prohibited by the sons themselves. 18 Ironically, then, in this deferred obedience of totemism, the spectre of the dead father returns as powerful as ever. Moreover, the actual tyrant is merely replaced by another master, a sacred object whose seemingly absolute and self-evident authority engenders the very emotional ambivalence that led to the original murder. As Freud notes, the very word sacred has attached to it the ambivalence of consecrated and detestable. 19 Thus, he notes, we find that the ambivalence implicit in the father complex persists in totemism and in religions generally. 20 In this way a vicious and stifling circle is closed. Whether it is hatred for the father or love for the father substitute, the sons are caught in the trap of their unresolved emotional ambivalence toward the authority figure, where to loosen the knot of hatred on one side is to tighten the knot of love on the other. As a repressive defense against this ambivalence and the imperfection it implies both in their worship and in the totem's power, love and awe for it are amplified further. The worshippers exist entirely under the shadow of a defense system that works to preserve the immense goodness of the totem. Even in the face of the most miserable misfortune, they find a way to exculpate the totem, just as original sin exculpates God. Driven by the guilty belief that they deserve such misfortune as punishment for the inadequacy of their worship, they impose on themselves even more 188 severe taboos. As Freud puts it, describing the relation between the ancient Jews and their God, driven by the need to satisfy this sense of guilt, which will be insatiable as long as there is misfortune, they impose taboos that grow ever stricter, more meticulous and even more trivial. 21 In this way, Freud grants that great moralistic heights, or extremes, are reached, but this rectitude, he insists, as originating not from desire for the good but from the sense of guilt felt on account of a suppressed hostility to God, displays the irrational excesses characteristic of obsessional neurotic reaction formations. Moreover, although any hint of injury to the totem is prohibited, as Freud cannily points out, the prohibition is only necessary because at some level it is recognized that the worshippers desire precisely such injury. Their awe and respect is never free of the tinge of fear, suspicion, envy, and hatred. If the totem persistently withdraws its promise of protection and bounty, the worshipper may repeat the murder, or wish to. 22 In recognizing this parasital desire, one also implicitly recognizes the imperfection of the totem. Totemism, then, not only expresses remorse and offers the hope of atonement and self-justification, but paradoxically it also serves as a reminder that the group ultimately has power over the totem. According to Freud, satisfaction concerning the triumph of the group over the father underpins the ritualized totem feast described as a festival at which the totem plan as a group kill and devour the totem, an act that is taboo to individuals. This festival, during which the restrictions of deferred obedience are lifted, Freud argues, would thus be a repetition and a commemoration of this memorable and criminal deed, which was the beginning of so many things, of social organization, of moral restrictions and of religion. 23 If Freud acknowledges that totemism as a religious-social institution is no longer an explicit form of life in modern societies, vestiges nevertheless remain, in pathologies, in all religions, and in, as Derrida points out, the archontic principle of the archive. If totemism, in Freud's words, arose from a filial sense of guilt in an attempt to allay that feeling and to appease the father by deferred obedience to him, then, he insists, all religions have the same end in view and are reactions to the same great event with which civilization began and which, since it occurred, has not allowed mankind a moment's rest. 24 To sum up, Freud's parasite myth of totem and taboo offers a psychological account of how an ideology perpetuates itself. In outline, he shows that the rebellion of a group against a strongly authoritarian tyrant leaves the group in a power vacuum where, due to a powerful residual need for authority, ambivalent forces of fear, guilt, and pride predominate. This 189 intolerable ambivalence, if left unresolved, leads the group to impose upon themselves the very restrictions they have just thrown off. The prohibitions once imposed on them by the tyrant are now internalized and self-imposed. Freud's genius, then, is to have seen this paradoxical circularity of the archontic principle. If, due to an overwhelming need for authority, the overcoming of tyranny results in totemism, the irony is that the greatest resistance to the father merely strengthens the tyrannical hold of his power over his sons. Notably, an economic relation to traditional institutions, which has often been privileged as the only genuine relation, takes the form of an archontic circle. This economic relation presupposes that an inventor is inspired with the truth and is compelled to pass it on to those to come, who, in turn, must maintain its purity against dissipating forces. Freud, then, offers a psychological account of why this economic archontic circle has such a compulsive power to hold father and son in its grip. He shows that power is perpetuated because an ideology, placed above the individual players as a totem, invents forward/defines the players, whether father or son, repeats itself through them, and prevents them from inventing themselves. Following Freud's indications, it is clear that to some extent, his classical articulation of the Oedipus complex, which he names the central experience of the formative years in early childhood, describes a movement at the individual level parallel to the archontic circle reflected in the parasite myth. 25 However, Freud views the archontic circle as a neurotic consequence of an inability to resolve the emotional ambivalence generated by the Oedipal desires, and he measures health in terms of a successful resolution of this ambivalence. 26 Given that he calls the archontic circle neurotic, the ultimate point of his efforts must be to show that it is also necessary to overcome the desperate need for a master, which motivates us to replace the father with a totem, in spite of the unhappiness this necessarily causes us. Consequently, one would expect a healthy outcome to correspond with the ability to step beyond the archontic circle. Presumably, totemism is overcome, if ever, with the realization that no sacred object or being can live up to the demands placed upon it. However, since the so-called healthy resolution of the Oedipus complex is itself troubled by internal tensions, it remains to be seen whether Freud's classical articulation of the Oedipus complex is sufficient to his ultimate requirement, for taking a step beyond the archontic circle implies subverting the desire for absolute power. Freud's classical articulation of the Oedipus complex as if Sophocles was saying to him, you are struggling in vain against your responsibility and are protesting in vain of what you 190 have done in opposition to these criminal intentions. You are guilty, for you have not been able to destroy them, they still persist in you unconsciously. And there is psychological truth in this. Even if a man has repressed his evil impulses into the unconscious and would like to tell himself afterwards that he is not responsible for them, he is nevertheless bound to be aware of this responsibility as a sense of guilt whose basis is unknown to him. 27 According to Freud, the Oedipus complex, whose nature can be deduced from the name he gave it, namely an erotic attachment to the mother and a desire to kill the father, is a situation which every child is destined to pass through and which follows inevitably from the factor of the prolonged period during which a child is cared for by other people. 28 A number of years of pre-Oedipal psychosexual organization and development precede the conflicts that characterize this complex, which occurs at a stage where sexual differences are being noticed and integrated by a child. For him, the Oedipus complex, as the first expression of sexual difference, occurs differently for boys and girls. Freud's initial formulation of the Oedipus complex in terms of sexual difference presents endless difficulties. One either stalls on these or acknowledges that there is nevertheless something to be gained from studying it. I tend to agree with Roy Scaffer that it is precisely its adaptability that gives Freud's Oedipus complex its power. As he puts it, for us, psychoanalysts, the most adaptable, trustworthy, inclusive, supportable, and helpful storyline of them all is the Oedipus complex in all its complexity and with all its surprises. 29 But to enter into this complexity, beginning with Freud's own suggestions concerning a positive and negative version for each sex, would be to step beyond the scope of this chapter. As a starting point, I shall outline Freud's classic statement of the Oedipus complex, taken from his An Outline of Psychoanalysis, which was written near the end of his life as a gathering together of his ideas. Notably, however, it is already possible to find in this statement the loose thread Lacan will take up in his revisions, and one will find in Lacan's revisions a guiding thread through the labyrinth of sexual difference. I will take up Lacan's arguments in detail in the chapters to follow. The masculine Oedipus complex. On the one hand, Freud argues, a boy's awakening genital sexuality is directed toward his mother as a desire to possess her physically. On the other hand, while admired as a model of enviable physical strength and 191 authority, the boy's father now becomes a rival and an obstacle to his attempts at seduction. Powerful fantasies of destroying the father and taking his place are supported by the father's periodic absences. In Freud's words, his satisfaction when his father disappears and his disappointment when he emerges again are deeply felt experiences. 30 Eventually constrained to curb her child's sexual attentions, the mother places a prohibition on masturbation, whose effect is only to modify the means by which he satisfies himself. Forced into greater severity, therefore, she threatens castration, and, moreover, assigns to the boy's father the task of carrying it out. Freud concedes that this castration threat can be imagined. It is put together from hints, prohibitions, and early sexual hypotheses. 31 The threat, real or fantasized, gathers credibility and force when the boy notices that some humans, sisters, really do lack penises, and its consequences are, Freud insists, multifarious and incalculable. 32 The castration threat, as noted, represents the first great parental betrayal whereby the boy's parents are lost to him as libidinal objects. As Freud puts it, if the satisfaction of love in the field of the Oedipus complex is to cost the child his penis, a conflict is bound to arise between his narcissistic interest in that part of his body and the libidinal cathexis of his parental objects. In this conflict the first of these forces normally triumphs. The child's ego turns away from the Oedipus complex. 33 Freud acknowledges that circumstances dictate the impact of the castration threat on a boy's budding sexual life, but generally speaking, faced with the danger of losing his penis, the boy's masculinity wilts. To save his precious organ he takes measures to avert the dangerous rivalry with his father. He renounces his mother, represses all desire to seduce her, gives up masturbation, and becomes passive toward his father, who therefore becomes no longer a rival but a fearsome threat. I have already addressed at some length the installation of the superego via the formation of an ideal ego through identification with the lost libidinal objects, the parents. Here, according to Freud, the admired father, now lost to fear, is introjected into the ego, where it forms the nucleus of the superego, which takes over the authority of the father and perpetuates his prohibition against mother incest. In this way, for Freud, the libidinal trends belonging to the Oedipus complex are desexualized and sublimated, or, that is, inhibited in their aim and changed into impulses of affection. But the boy's fantasy life is magnified and, simultaneously, unconscious fears and hatreds directed towards his father intensified. 34 Further, despite his conscious renunciation of his mother, he remains dependent on her love, for the threat of betrayal, of being handed over to the father for castration, looms large. As a general rule, unable to master 192 these Oedipal conflicts, he finally represses them. The Oedipus complex is abandoned, repressed, and, in most normal cases, entirely destroyed, and a severe superego is set up as its heir. 35 Alternatively, these repressed conflicts remain preserved in the unconscious, ready to resurface as symptoms when triggered by related stresses. 36 Sex-related conflicts tend to resurface at puberty, when the boy is confronted with a new developmental task, namely that of detaching his libidinal wishes from the parent figures and directing them toward a real outside love object in relation to his parents. He is required to effect a reconciliation where oppositional relations have persisted and free himself from residual subservience. Moreover, Freud insists, he is required to tame and restrict his sexual instinct and subject it to an individual will which is identical with the bidding of society. 37 As compensation for his libidinal renunciations, a share in his father's authority is promised to his future, which he is free to exercise at will, for example, over the woman he selects as a mother substitute. There are certain parallels between the structure of the parasite myth and that of the Oedipus complex as described so far. The boy's incestuous and aggressive Oedipal desires are the equivalent of the hypothesized original parasite in Totem and Taboo. 38 The fear of castration, which forces the boy to repress his Oedipal desires and to install a superego modeled on his father, matches the brother's fear and remorse, reflected in their efforts to repress or forget their deed by substituting a totem father for the lost father and submitting to what would have been their father's desire by instituting various taboos. The ambivalence of the boy's subsequent unconscious fantasies mirrors the brother's emotional ambivalence toward the totem in the form of self-punishing guilt, but also in the satisfaction over the killing as reflected in the totem feast. The divergence occurs, at least apparently, when Freud announces that the ambivalent emotions of the Oedipus complex must be resolved if the boy is to become a healthy adult. Such resolution indeed parallels what is reflected in the incest taboo, namely, the promotion of exogamy, and in the social contract, as a brotherhood among men, for it includes the obligation to find an outside love object and to subject an overpowering libido to the bidding of the group. But it also includes the task of reconciliation with and detachment from the parent figures and the superego that represents their authority. Remarkably, Freud notes, these universal tasks are seldom dealt with in an ideal manner. 39 He adds, by neurotics, however, no solution at all is arrived at. The son remains all his life bound beneath his father's authority and he is unable to transfer his libido to an outside sexual object. 193 In his attempt to resolve his Oedipus complex, a boy will find a place somewhere on an unbroken continuum between debilitating obsessional neurosis and healthy independence. 40 Briefly, those who suffer from obsessional neuroses are terrorized by violent impulses they disavow as alien and objectionable and against which they compulsively carry out various protective prohibitions, renunciations and restrictions. 41 Facing these internal terrors, sufferers become overconscientious and more than ordinarily correct in their behavior. 42 Accordingly, Freud notes, these impulses never, literally never, force their way through to performance. What the patient actually carries out, his so-called obsessional actions, are very harmless and certainly trivial things, for the most part repetitions or ceremonial elaborations of the activities of ordinary life. 43 Nevertheless, such obsessional actions place excessively severe restrictions on objects, words, or actions, which require compulsive rituals of expiation and purification if the prohibition is even inadvertently transgressed. 44 While sufferers are quite capable of self-censure on account of the irrational and debilitating nature of these actions, they cannot help themselves, and they remain caught up in extremely tedious and almost insoluble tasks. Moreover, given this discrepancy, their mental life remains ambivalent. Obsessions impose themselves with dogmatic persistence, while niggling intellectual doubts ensure that sufferers experience an ever-increasing degree of indecision, loss of energy and restrictions of freedom in cases of obsessional neurosis. Freud explains, a sufferer has failed to detach his libido from its Oedipal objects. 45 Had his ego condoned this fixation, his sex life, Freud insists, would have remained infantile and therefore perverse, but no neurosis would have developed. The self-imposed taboos and rituals of an obsessional neurotic, however, are symptoms that help bind the extreme anxiety caused by the ego's reactions against its infantile libidinal fixations. 46 These taboos, in other words, although displaced onto other objects or into seemingly irrational, unconnected rituals, are ultimately found to be prohibitions on killing the father or on incest with the mother or sisters. To explain why obsessional actions seem to have the contrary purpose of preventing rather than substituting for satisfaction, Freud reminds one that to prohibit something implies a desire for it and a dread of that desire. Symptoms are therefore, in his words, the products of a compromise and arise from the mutual interference between two opposing currents. They represent not only the repressed but also the repressing force which had a share in their origin. 47 Again, as Freud notes, most of the urges of sexual life are not of a purely erotic nature but have arisen from alloys of the erotic instinct with portions of 194 The destructive instinct. 48 As noted above, obsessional symptoms are commonly provoked by excessive sadistic impulses, and the symptoms, he argues, serve predominantly as a defense against these wishes or give expression to the struggle between satisfaction and defense. But a sadistic impulse can be satisfied safely by directing it against the self, turning sufferers into consummate self-tormentors. 49 Notably, Freud suggests that a good alternative for the name obsessional neurosis would be taboo sickness. 50 In other words, he places the outcome of the parasite myth in totemism, which is the precursor to religion and exemplar of the archontic circle, on the side of obsessional neurosis. In his words, I have never doubted that religious phenomena are only to be understood on the pattern of the individual neurotic symptoms familiar to us, as the return of the long since forgotten, important events in the primeval history of the human family, and that they have to thank precisely this origin for their compulsive character. 51 But if an obsessional neurosis, whether individual or writ large in totemism, stems from an inability to detach oneself from one's Oedipal objects and a consequent inability to escape the trap of the archontic circle, by implication, the successful resolution of the Oedipus complex, which achieves independence from the father's authority and the mother's sexual power, should break it open. However, independence from parental power is not identical to a critique of its source, namely patriarchal convention. Rather, the boy's Oedipalization is encouraged by the promise of a share in the power of the brotherhood, which will free him from the personal power of his father. With the pseudo-democracy of the brotherhood, that is to say, patriarchal convention, behind him, he can do what he cannot do alone, namely assess, criticize, and stand up to the father as an equal. But he pays a price. To be recognized as a member of this totem clan, each brother has to renounce his singularity. The promised respite for the son vis-a-vis the father, namely the pseudo-democratic vice grip of patriarchal convention, turns out to be equally restrictive, for it is just a takeover of the archive by the brothers, not a critique of it. The aprior of masculine Oedipalization, then, is that both neurosis, remaining subjugated to the will and power of the father, and health, remaining subjugated to the patriarchal convention inscribed in the law of the brotherhood, represent a betrayal of singularity. This, in turn, troubles the very idea of psychoanalytic therapy, which claims its greatest successes in relation to the neuroses. 52 Success in the psychoanalytic treatment of neurosis, which is supposed to help one finally resolve one's Oedipus complex, could be measured in terms of the dissolution of symptoms, but this may turn out to promote independence. 195 Merely as detachment vis-a-vis the parents and acceptance into the brotherhood. But success in treatment could also be measured by the extent to which the subject has developed enough power, not merely rational prowess, to distance the ego from the superego, assess the merits of its commands, and act with critical judgment. 53 Here, one assumes that successful psychoanalysis helps engender in an individual the power to go beyond masculine health, to achieve instead the power to refuse power, to assess the merits of the archons, institutions, ideologies, or discourses that constitute his life world, and in this way to step out of the archontic circle. Despite his pessimism regarding the mass of mankind and indications to the contrary in his mantric repetition of patriarchal prejudices concerning women, Freud undeniably opens up a gap here in the archontic circle. In other words, one might, and should, be suspicious of his masculine Oedipus complex. It has its surprises, however, for Freud implies here that such critical power is not derived from strengthening the ego against the scattering effects of the sex drive, or object libido, by a gathering together aimed at shoring up its unity, integrity, and rationality, as if it is required to stand fast against an adversary. Rather, the subject's critical power is a function of its recognition of its own singularity and flexibility, which goes hand in hand with the enabling power of inventive self-sublimation and ethical decisiveness. If one suspects, therefore, that Freud has already begun to show more than he intended regarding a possible critique of patriarchy, this suspicion is confirmed in reflection upon the feminine version of the Oedipus complex. Reading Freud somewhat against himself, one may propose, with Lacan, that he here demonstrates what he saw without seeing, namely, that if an archontic ideology needs a binary against which to define its source of power, as does patriarchy, this will be the source of its undoing. Moreover, in unwittingly demonstrating the structure of its undoing in the feminine Oedipus complex, Freud, against his overt convictions, confirms that patriarchy is not necessary or normative, but historical. The feminine Oedipus complex. Since the parasite myth mirrors the Oedipus complex only in its masculine articulation, one is led to assume that the construction of the social contract and the development of cultural institutions such as law, morality, and religion may be attributed entirely to the masculine psyche. Notably, the parasite myth outlined in Totem and Taboo has almost nothing to say about feminine agency. Women figure in it only as objects of incestuous desire and as passive subjects of and to taboos, that are specially 196 designed to control masculine desires. For Freud, the two fundamental taboos of totemism created by the brothers out of their filial sense of guilt correspond only to the two repressed wishes of the masculine Oedipus complex, to kill the father and to seduce the mother. 54 One gets the impression that, having already constructed the Oedipus complex in masculine terms, Freud simply tried to inscribe a girl's Oedipal experience in it, as its negative or as its symmetrical, binary, opposite. In outline, for Freud, the infant girl equally desires the mother and vainly attempts to seduce her, but has as rivals not only the father but also the brothers for her exclusive attention. 55 However, she finds herself to be intrinsically under-endowed in relation to these rivals. In Freud's words, a female child has, of course, no need to fear the loss of a penis. She must, however, react to the fact of not having received 156. This claim can in fact be translated into less comical terms. Without ever having noticed a boy's genitals, it would have taken precious little for a Victorian girl to recognize that she lacked preference vis-a-vis her brothers. Forced to react to this inferior status, she would naturally have envied them their privilege and desired that favor for herself. Initially, Freud insists, she simply attempts to mimic the boys in all respects. Concerning masturbation, however, in his words, it often happens that she fails to obtain sufficient satisfaction and extends her judgment of inferiority from her stunted penis to her whole self. As a rule, she soon gives up masturbating, since she has no wish to be reminded of the superiority of her brother or playmate, and turns away from sexuality altogether. 57 However, unconsciously she remains unappeasably envious of the boys, to the extent that, Freud insists, her whole development may be said to take place under the colors of envy for the penis. She does not need to be forced to abandon the mother, for her penis envy is sufficient motivation. She cannot forgive her mother for having sent her into the world so insufficiently equipped, and her resentment motivates her to find a substitute. The father is the obvious candidate, for unlike the mother, he appears capable of giving her what she lacks. According to Freud, this substitution takes shape in her unconscious as a wish to have his penis at her disposal, but it culminates in another wish, to have a baby from him as a gift. 58 In other words, she soon realizes that her route to power will have to lie in renouncing she who is powerless and in seducing he who has it potentially to give. She, therefore, enters into competitive rivalry with her mother for the father's affections. Again, when these unconscious conflicts resurface, she is confronted with the same task of detachment and reconciliation and the same promise of health, if this is successful, or risk of neurosis, if it is not. However, 197 On Freud's account, the consequences of the Oedipus complex are asymmetrical for men and women. It is a lack, rather than the threat of a loss, that forces females into their Oedipus complex, which occurs as unconscious aggression toward the mother and a desire to seduce the father. In the formation of an ideal ego, she identifies herself with the being whose place she covets, but there is no compensation in this identification with an inferior being for whom her residual disgust remains irremediable and apparently irrelevant. In Freud's words, it does little harm to a woman if she remains in her feminine Oedipus attitude. She will in that case choose her husband for his paternal characteristics and be ready to recognize his authority. 59 Her bleak destiny in a patriarchal order, then, masquerading as health, becomes one of self-hatred and dependence. On the other hand, what is described by Freud as her neurosis, her inability to transfer her father love to a husband and her refusal to reconcile with her mother, can be translated as her hysterical refusal to accept the authority of a lesser god, convention, and resign herself to her inferiority. It is hardly surprising that this version of the Oedipus complex has met with outright resistance, and one is tempted to laugh the whole thing out of court. But there is nevertheless something important to be gained from this articulation, namely that by default it shows that in relation to women, something in the archontic circle breaks open, leaving a gap for the critique of patriarchy. In health, that is, in resignation to her inferiority, a girl remains equally trapped by patriarchy. But in neurosis, she refuses to be submissive and remains attached to what she views as the potential source of her own power. Here, then, the archontic circle cannot close. In the feminine version of the Oedipus complex, neurosis is a position of critique that cannot be reappropriated by patriarchy. It is hardly surprising that a woman may resist the cure and choose rather to challenge an order that defines her health in terms of her inferiority and dependence. To sum up, reflection upon Freud's articulation of the Oedipus complex yields the following ironies. In its most conservative masculine version, health names the perpetuation of patriarchal convention whereby an individual renounces his singularity in the name of the group. Here, the singular authority of the father is simply replaced by the superego which represents the internalization of patriarchal convention. However, and this marks the opening of a gap, a preferred position beyond such health is indicated, whereby the singular asserts its power of critique vis-a-vis the superego. This gap is opened wider in the feminine version of the Oedipus complex, for, as it turns out, feminine health is here defined in terms of her acceptance of an inferior status and submission to 198 a husband's authority. What is, conversely, called neurosis, namely the refusal to submit to a patriarchal order, may just be the equivalent in feminine terms of the preferred position that takes a man beyond health. So far, I have tried to amplify the first part of Derrida's thesis by reconstructing Freud's account of the neurotic archontic circle in Totem and Taboo, and by showing that to some extent, through the gaps, wittingly and unwittingly, opened up in his articulation of the Oedipus complex, he indicated a way out of it. However, the tension between these openings provided by his theoretical statements and his own continued patriarchy and archontic commitments in practice leaves one troubled by questions concerning the movement of the archontic circle in Freudian psychoanalysis. The second part of Derrida's thesis, then, concerns the tension whereby Freud remains under the spell of the very archontic principle he has so insightfully brought to light and decisively subverted, for the archontic circle springs its trap only if one takes for granted the seemingly obvious relationship of priority between the inventive signature and the interpretative counter-signature, or, one might add, between the notion of a purely active, giving out that constitutes writing a text, and the supposedly passive, receiving in that characterizes reading it. Yet he remained curiously bound by the precisely equivalent binary associated with the terms of his parasite myth, father and son, master and disciple. Certainly, one does not break out of the circle, as Freud demonstrated, by murdering the father. Rather, as Derrida confirms in both Psyche, which stresses the paradoxical predicaments in which the concept invention remains tied up, and Ulysses 60, which focuses on the related apoetics of interpretation, the archontic circle is internally ruined precisely because the interpreter as much as the inventor invents the invention, or, in other terms, in the event of signature 61 the double, interpretative yes co-constitutes the singular inventive yes 62 to relate it to the inventor of psychoanalysis. The relations between Freud as inventive son and as father inventor and between inventive inventor and his interpreters are reciprocal, apoetic, entangled, contaminated. The mutual threats posed to each other by the double yes of repetition and the singularity of the inventive yes are double-sided, related in one direction to the past archive and in the other to the archive to come. This binds Freud to an inescapably ambivalent relation both to the past archive and to the archive to come. Conversely, one may argue, the archontic circle is perpetuated insofar as one does not recognize this intrinsic mutual contamination of father 199 and son because Freud did not recognize this contamination. His position is divided incompatibly between what is aneconomic about the inventiveness by which he instituted psychoanalysis and what is economic about its institutionalization. Moreover, insofar as the murderous sons, as readers of the father inventor, do not themselves recognize this contamination, psychoanalysis becomes an ideology, and they remain caught in the circular trap of the archontic circle. By contrast, in making this kind of argument, Derrida sees himself as a paradoxically inventive interpreter of Freud who is, therefore, not entirely bound into the archontic circle. Anticipating the theme of Part 3, it seems to me that Lacan's notorious return to Freud places him in precisely the same relation. Invention/convention, Derrida's analysis of Freud's economic recapitulation. Freud was the inventor of psychoanalysis. But what does this mean if the concept invention, as Derrida points out, is periodically reinvented and has shifted in determination from inventive discovery to productive discovery? 63 Reflecting its more primordial, uneconomic sense, one is tempted to think that there will be no invention unless there is an unpredictable, inspired or lucky stroke of genius, a revealing flash in which something original origin reoccurs as a singular transgression that shakes off the debris of past convention. 64 Moreover, as Derrida notes, the uniqueness or novelty of invention requires that this first time is also a last time. Archaeology and eschatology acknowledge each other here in the irony of the one and only instant. 65 On this understanding of invention, psychoanalysis as the genius of Freud's singular inventiveness would unavoidably strike the past archive as a traumatic disruption, a rewriting that changes everything, without any possibility of return, for it will have made of the tradition a lie, or at least showed it up for the invented fiction it really was. In many respects, Freud made precisely this impression on the past archive. Classic examples are his propositions concerning the psychical apparatus as divided and internally conflicted, unconscious motivating forces in behavior, the etiology of the neuroses in childhood sexuality, and the tie between religion and neurosis. But, as Derrida warns, along the lines of quintessentially Freudian argument treated at length in the previous chapter, things are not so simple. This purely an economic determination of invention is impossible, for it indicates a misunderstanding of the real constraints on invention. 66 Here, one must pose a question concerning temporality. Can 200 Freud's invention of psychoanalysis have occurred in an atemporal, original reflash of inspiration, in a momentous reconfiguration, at the moment that he renounced hypnosis, that configures the shape of all that is to come? Alternatively, to occur at all must it have extended over time? 67 The answer, for Derrida, is undecidible. If invention is to remain true to its concept, one must indeed think of inventive novelty in terms of an economic instant. Yet, simultaneously, the concept cannot but bear traces of temporal relativity. Concerning the temporal mode of the past, the event of invention only makes sense against possibilities already instituted. As Derrida insists, invention has never meant creation ex nihilo but rather the uncovering for the first time of something always already possible but previously unrecognized and calling out for inventive recognition. 68 In other words, the inventive positing of something, the inventive yes already occurs in response to, and concomitantly as a threat to, another call, of the archive past, or beyond this, of being, a god, justice, gift, thing, real, anterior to its instituting or inventive performance. 69 As always already a response, then, an invention is given its status as original or transgressive only if it is, in Derrida's words, protected by a system of conventions that will ensure for it at the same time its recording in a common history, its belonging to a culture, to a heritage, a lineage, a pedagogical tradition, a discipline, a chain of generations. 70 But this means that invention can never have been the inaugurating event of something entirely novel. As Derrida notes, any inventor faces the paradox of always already having had to sign away the originality of an invention, of having to presuppose the numerous conventions implied in making something at all and in making it public, a contract, consensus, promise, commitment, institution, law, legality, legitimation. 71 Consequently, as much as Freud's inventiveness threatens the past archive, so, to the extent that the father as archon can control the archive, dictate its contents, and keep control over its effects, the impression made on Freud by the ideological power of the past archive poses threats to Freud's inventiveness, not least of which is the threatened imposition of the archontic circle. Freud faced a double threat in the name of the father in relation to his actual father. He persistently resisted paternal attempts to draw him back into the religious fold of the totem clan. In relation to the brotherhood, the traumatic novelty of his propositions concerning the psyche, sexuality, and religion is strikingly juxtaposed with his unreflective, patriarchal conventionality concerning women. So far, I have addressed only one side of the story, for invention has a relation not only to the temporal moment of the past but also to the future. As mentioned, invention has gradually been reinvented, so that 201 the notion today refers predominantly to productive rather than inventive discovery. In this shift, invention turns away from the past and faces the future. It is thought of less readily as the uncovering of hidden content and more readily as, in Derrida's words, the productive discovery of an apparatus that we can call technical in the broad sense, techno-scientific or techno-poetic. 72 That is, invention becomes the invention of machines, methods, or theoretical structures and systems specially designed to help us perceive what is missing in our knowledge. Invent the means to find it, and eliminate controversy. Here, in its economic articulation, inventions program the production of more inventions. A shift in perspective from considering Freud as an inventive son vis-a-vis the archontic fathers to viewing him as a father inventor of psychoanalysis whose aim was to codify his ideas into a scientific institution mirrors this shift from the uneconomic sense of invention to the economic. Here, then, the discovery of psychoanalytic truths would be programmable through its already invented artifacts, the logico-discursive mechanisms, theoretical structures, and methods authored and authorized by Freud, such as the Oedipus complex, which are designed to ensure the repeatability of its truths. 73 As Derrida notes, invention would be subject to powerful movements of authoritarian prescription and anticipation. 74 The obvious danger is encapsulated in Leibniz's claim for his universal characteristics, namely that it saves the mind and the imagination, the use of which must above all be controlled. 75 In trying to predict and control what comes to us as invention, would we not have lost the sense of inventiveness altogether? As Derrida asks, can we still call a programmed invention an invention? 76 Rather, it would seem, even as he was himself inventive to the extent that Freud refused to recognize his dependence on his interpreters, his contamination by them, he became a force determined to suffocate inventiveness. Here, the father inventor tried to secure the immortality of his invention, positing it only to repeat itself in his sons as his legacy. As father inventor, Freud would assume the kind of mastery that constitutes his interpreters as submissively obedient disciples or murderous dissidents, placing them all permanently under the shadow of a debt they can neither escape nor pay off. He of all people should have been sensitive to the paradox that the father's very demand for immortalization as repetition of the same in the sons brings upon him, in consequence, the fatal effects of their emotional ambivalence. To clarify this argument, Derrida does not here reduce Freud's scientific enterprise to its economic moment. He is, however, justifiably suspicious of the authoritarian streak in Freud that does not want to relinquish 202 his control over psychoanalysis. Such authoritarianism risks the radical grain in Freud's writings for the sake of constructing programmable truths which goes against the grain of his own inventive scientific practice, which drew from investigations constantly underway in his everyday psychoanalytic work. Since generalization is intrinsic to the definition of science, one might say that he based his science on what his one-to-one relations with singular analysans indicated about more general psychical structures and relations. The urge towards programming takes over when one refuses to allow these structures to mutate in the hands of other analysts. In the course of his own investigations, Freud allowed his theoretical structures to mutate on the basis of what he learned from his practical encounters. But to the extent that he does not grant his followers the same inventiveness, he succumbs to the urge toward programming. What remains unacknowledged in any hierarchical master-disciple relation is that the inventive gesture only ever begins as a promise. It is never a matter of positing something complete or even something potentially complete that merely requires patient actualization. Rather, inventive positing is at best an intention to be the beginning of something. As a gesture, it is internally structured as a kind of telephonic spacing, as inherently calling for, or desiring, the repeated responsive affirmation from an understanding interpreter at the other end of the line, who ought to put the seal on the identity and integrity of the invention. 77 In other words, to become what it is, Derrida insists, invention will also need the signature or the counter-signature of the other, let's say here that of the son who is not the invention of the father. As if the son's counter-signature bore the legitimating authority. 78 In the unforeseeable time to come, then, the power of recognition may or may not constitute the event as an invention, as the inauguration of a possibility that will remain at the disposal of everyone. Moreover, even if the interpreter responds with an affirmation, the interpretation is, in principle, never adequate to its constitutive task, making it impossible to terminate the call. Clearly, therefore, both Freud as singular father inventor and the legacy of institutionalized Freudian psychoanalysis are vulnerable to the lack of repetition. Freud as singular inventor is vulnerable to parasite in the name of psychoanalysis as an ideology, as the great source of truth that defines both father and sons and supersedes even Freud. In this case, in the assumption that she or he, even better than Freud, knows what psychoanalysis truly is, even the most inventive psychoanalyst remains trapped within the archontic circle. What this son loves in the father is the projection of his own desire for omniscience, omnipotence, and immortality, that is, his own desire to identify with the power-giving ideology, which is to be the father, which does not necessarily coincide with 203 the father's desire for the son. What the son hates in the father does not stem from his harshness so much as the son's, which regrets the father's tendency to fall short of the demands of the ideology, which is itself often a constituted effect of the son's projection. Thus regarding the singular father inventor with admiring, affectionate but also with frustration, the interpreter does not return to Freud as an orthodox mimic of his word but to what is profoundly true in his words, the kernel of truth Freud may not have explicitly recognized or remained faithful to. Here, the son's loyalty lies with the ideology of psychoanalysis, not with Freud, and in this sense, Freud is murdered. But psychoanalysis becomes, in his place, the mystical authority, the totem. As already an institution, Freud's invention is threatened less by the non-response of schizophrenia, in which the lack of temporal continuity erases memory and history, than by the possibility of violent misrecognition. But psychoanalysis is also, on the contrary, vulnerable to over-conscientious repetition. The inventiveness of Freud's invention is threatened by the very precision of the repetition in orthodox Freudianism. For if the interpretation repeats the invention mechanically or compulsively, the inventive stroke is converted from being a decision after which everything changes shape into merely the first of a programmable, predictable series of expected acts. In this way, it is delivered a death threat, the threat of stasis, sterility, or paralysis. To sum up so far, because invention, in both senses, and interpretation contaminate one another and cannot be separated out into coherent concepts, Freud's relations as inventive son and father inventor tie him up in a double bind. Paradoxically, his invention of psychoanalysis must claim uniqueness even if in Derrida's words, the uniqueness has to be repeatable since an invention never takes place without convention or recognition. If, as Freud has so clearly demonstrated, invention begins by being susceptible to repetition, exploitation, reinscription, it can be neither the ephemeral insignificance of a one and only chance instant nor entertain its own destruction as the predictable effect of a conventional past and the advent of a programmable future. Invention, in either sense, is impossible. Again, for the invention of psychoanalysis to come to life at all, it has to be repeated or affirmed in a recognizing response. But perfect repetition places it under the threat of living death. Repetition, therefore, both necessarily constitutes and threatens to destroy it. By the same token, for there to be living, recognizing repetition at all, there must first have been an invention. But its priority, in which is inscribed its power for institutionalization, the power to form a history of effects or tradition, as opposed to being forgotten or passed over, threatens to suffocate 204 the ones who come second under the weight of debt. The invention, therefore, both necessarily constitutes and threatens to destroy the interpretation. Concluding remarks: if one cannot resolve these double binds, how then does one respond to the invention of psychoanalysis? According to Derrida, a negotiation of psychoanalysis requires one to hear within the Freudian call for response a tone of laughter that always haunts the disempowering laugh of omnipotence and mastery. 79 This is the affirmative laugh of the gift which does not cut down the power of commentary in advance but instead cuts itself open, gives itself out as a provocation, and dares the surprise in another reading, which as a reading would still be, and yet is not, a repetition of the same. Such negotiation also requires the interpreter to take advantage of the opening conferred by this gift, to embrace the paradox of having to repeat the first yes differently. As a reader, one must simultaneously respectfully recognize the first yes and disrespectfully suspend it in order to reinvent it, or to make anew the decision concerning a responsible response, that is, a response that is still a recognition, and not a violation beyond the point of no return, but that is, at the same time, not faithful to the point of death. In other words, just like the invention, the responsible response has to be both the affirmation that confers a certain conventional legitimacy and determinacy upon what is already there and an inventive stroke of genius in its own right. In short, in response to Freud's invention, one must, in turn, become an inventive interpreter. Does one move beyond psychoanalysis by treating Freud's inventiveness as a gift rather than by accepting his invention as the imposition of a science whose truth must be preserved and refined? Derrida's answer, characteristically, is a refusal to answer, precisely because Freudian psychoanalysis troubles itself by this very question. If Freud, on the one hand, consistently tried to codify his ideas into a science, on the other hand, psychoanalytic notions, without Freud consistently and explicitly recognizing this, already, from the start, resist themselves, or auto-deconstruct, implicitly opening psychoanalysis to this step beyond it. Consequently, one could argue, insofar as it aims to be a science, those who acknowledge its auto-deconstructive element step beyond it. But insofar as psychoanalysis auto-deconstructs, it has already inscribed this unsettling moment of radical destruction within it. In acknowledging such auto-deconstruction, one does not step beyond psychoanalysis but instead brings to the surface what is already unconsciously inscribed in it. 205 To adumbrate the further development of this study, one may ask what is at stake in the question concerning Lacan's notorious return to Freud. The foregoing discussion indicates three alternatives. The least plausible is that Lacan's return to Freud should be taken literally, thereby placing him among the neurotic sons who are unable to resolve their Oedipal attachment to Father Freud and simply repeat his desire in obsessive orthodoxy. As he notes, you all know that on occasion I know how to take liberties with Freud's texts and affirm my distance. It is also implausible, given the strong motif of ideology critique in his writings, that Lacan's affirmation of his distance from the letter of Freud's texts places him among the murderous brothers who would negate Freud's singularity as self-inventor in the name of psychoanalysis as an ideology. The third and most plausible suggestion, then, is that his return to Freud is ironic, since he has moved beyond health to the power of critique. Importantly, in turn, the question of Lacan's return to Freud, it seems, turns on whether he acknowledges the auto-deconstructive moment in psychoanalysis or whether his critique aims to replace Freudian psychoanalysis with a new master discourse, in this way ensuring that he remains, for all his inventiveness, caught up in the metaphysics of presence. If Derrida places his money on the latter, mine, as I hope to show in the remaining chapters, is on the former.